In 2024, researchers opened teeth and bones from 7 people in Morocco, folks who lived 15,000 years ago. They were testing for one thing: where did most of their protein come from? Meat, like every paleo cookbook on the planet insists? Nope. Plants. Plants were the main protein source, not meat. That result should have been impossible if the paleo diet story were true. It wasn't, and it's not the only study saying it. By the end of this video, you'll know what our ancestors actually put in their mouths, according to the bones, the teeth, and the fossilized food scraps, not according to a supplement company. You'll find out why a Neanderthal's jawbone from Iraq had plant starch baked onto it. You'll learn why the first fire our ancestors used probably wasn't for cooking at all, and you'll see why a caveman eating acorns had cavities just like you'd get from candy. None of this is a guess. It's chemistry, and it's written directly into fossilized teeth. Here's what most people miss. Prehistoric isn't one era with one menu. It covers roughly 2.5 million years, from the first stone tools to the start of farming around 10,000 BCE. That's longer than every human civilization that ever built a pyramid, wrote a law code, or minted a coin, combined, several times over. Expecting one single prehistoric diet is like asking what humans in general eat for lunch and expecting one answer for Tokyo, Texas, and the Amazon at the same time. So how do scientists actually figure out what people ate that long ago when there's no menu, no receipt, nothing written down? Mainly 2 ways. First, isotope analysis. Your bone collagen literally records a chemical signature of what you ate over years of your life, and researchers can compare nitrogen and carbon ratios to figure out roughly how much of your protein came from plants versus animals, and even land animals versus fish. Second, dental calculus, the hardened plaque stuck to fossilized teeth. That plaque traps microscopic starch grains, plant fibers, even bits of cooked food. And it's basically an ancient doggy bag that survived for tens of thousands of years. Put the 2 together and you stop guessing. You start reading receipts. One more number worth knowing before we go further. When researchers pool together everything we know across sites and time periods, prehistoric human diets show an estimated range of roughly 14 to 35% of calories from protein, 21 to 55% from carbohydrate, and 12 to 58% from fat. That's an enormous spread. It means somewhere out there was a real prehistoric population eating a diet as carb-heavy as anything a modern nutritionist would call high carb, and another population living almost entirely on fat and protein, and both of them were completely normal humans doing what their environment allowed. Fossil evidence from Israel dating back roughly 800,000 years even shows a diet built mainly around seeds, wild fruit, vegetables, and nuts, with meat and fish as the smaller share, not the main event. Let's start with the group everyone assumes were pure meat machines, the Neanderthals. Multiple isotope studies from European Neanderthal sites in France and Belgium show nitrogen ratios so high they land in the same range as top predators, wolves, hyenas, lions. For a while, that seemed to settle it. Neanderthals were apex carnivores, eating mostly large game like mammoths and rhinos. But here's where it gets more layered. Those same Belgian samples showed that plant matter still made up around 20% of the diet. Not dominant, but not nothing either. And separately, when researchers looked at Neanderthal dental calculus from sites in Iraq and Belgium, they found something that isotopes alone couldn't show. Starch grains from date palms, legumes, and grass seeds, some of them chemically altered in ways consistent with cooking. A Neanderthal, sitting near a fire, eating a starchy plant that had been heated. So Neanderthals weren't strict carnivores, and they weren't secretly vegetarians either. They were heavy meat eaters who also processed and cooked plants when the environment offered them, which is a very different picture from either extreme you'll hear online. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you, though. All of this plant processing and cooking assumes our ancestors had reliable, mastered fire. And the story of when humans actually got good at using fire is stranger and much older than most people think. Researchers working at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa recently pushed the timeline for fire use back to somewhere between 1.07 and 1.79 million years ago. That's not a typo. Nearly 2 million years. The evidence comes from tiny burned bones deep in the cave, detected using a technique that reads chemical changes left behind when bone is heated. Now, before you picture Homo erectus flipping steaks over a campfire, the researchers are careful here. This wasn't fire making. It looks more like fire scavenging, catching flame from a natural wildfire outside and carrying it into the cave, then keeping it alive as long as possible. That's still a genuinely big behavioral leap: planning, transport, maintenance, but it's not the same as cooking a meal on purpose every night. The evidence for regular, reliable, everyday cooking is younger and still debated, but the strongest, most consistent signs point to somewhere around 3 to 400,000 years ago, at sites tied to both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, where researchers find repeated hearths, burned material layered again and again in the same spots. And why does this matter for your dinner? Because cooking does something meat and raw plants alone can't. It breaks down tough plant fibers and starches, unlocks more calories per bite, and cuts down the energy your gut spends digesting. Some researchers argue that shift is directly tied to why our brains, which are incredibly energy-hungry organs, were able to grow the way they did. And before fire was even part of the picture at all, our ancestors weren't picky. Dental plaque from a hominin who lived roughly 1.2 million years ago in northern Spain shows raw animal tissue, uncooked starch grains, pollen, and fragments of insects, all stuck in the same mouth. Bugs weren't a punishment on a survival show. They were dinner, and a genuinely smart source of protein and fat that required zero hunting skill to catch. And plant processing itself goes back even further than that. At a site called Gesher Beno Yaakov, on the banks of the Jordan River, researchers found starch grains roughly 780,000 years old stuck to basalt tools, hammerstones, and anvils that had been used to crack, pound, and grind acorns, legumes, and aquatic plants. Nearly a million years before anyone planted a single crop, someone was already sitting by a riverbank systematically processing plant food with dedicated tools. That's not a species stumbling onto the occasional berry. That's a species with a plant food processing toolkit, passed down and refined over unimaginable stretches of time. Here's the twist that really undercuts the modern paleo equals no carbs, no cavities pitch. Researchers studying dental calculus from early modern humans in East Asia, dated between roughly 120,000 and 80,000 years ago, recovered a huge number of starch grains, about 40% of them from acorns. One of those individuals had cavities, actual tooth decay, tens of thousands of years before a single grain of wheat was ever farmed. And it's not an isolated case. At a site in Israel called Ohalo 2, 23,000 years old, archaeologists pulled more than 90,000 individual plant remains from over 140 different species out of the ground. Wild wheat and barley were in there, sure, but they were vastly outnumbered by small wild grass seeds, over 16,000 of them, next to just a few hundred wheat grains. This was a hunter-gatherer campsite, thousands of years before agriculture, and the plate looked less like a steakhouse and more like a very ambitious grain bowl. So if fossils show this much variation, what happens when you actually watch living hunter-gatherers eat in real time for years? That's exactly what anthropologists have done with the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last groups on Earth still living mostly off wild foraging and hunting. The numbers should stop any paleo equals meat argument cold. Roughly 65% of Hadza calories come from carbohydrates, mostly wild tubers, berries, baobab fruit, and honey. Protein sits around 24%, mostly from hunted game. Fat is the smallest slice, around 11%. And honey alone, which both Hadza men and women rank as their favorite food on the planet, can supply somewhere between 15 and 20% of their total yearly calories. That's an enormous amount of natural sugar, coming straight out of a tree for a population with strikingly low rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. The diet also isn't fixed. It swings hard with the seasons. Dry season, more meat, because animals cluster around scarce water sources. Wet season, more honey and berries, sometimes stretching into what researchers call months without meat at all. Multiply that kind of seasonal, regional swing across every hunter-gatherer population that ever lived, in deserts, rainforests, coastlines, and ice age tundra, and you get exactly what the fossil record already told us. There was never one prehistoric diet. There were thousands. And sometimes you get incredibly lucky and find one specific individual meal preserved almost perfectly. Ötzi the Iceman, the 5,300-year-old mummy found frozen in the Alps in 1991, still had a full stomach when he died. Scientists analyzed it directly. Roughly half of the contents were pure animal fat from ibex and red deer, alongside einkorn wheat and traces of a toxic fern he may have eaten to fight off intestinal parasites. That's one real person's actual last meal, chemically verified, not reconstructed from guesswork. High fat, some grain, some wild meat, eaten right before a grueling trek through a freezing mountain pass. It's a snapshot that fits perfectly into the pattern. Whatever the environment demanded, that's what got eaten. In whatever ratio kept a person alive and moving. Put the isotopes, the dental calculus, the burned bones, and the modern hunter-gatherer data together, and the picture that emerges looks almost nothing like the meat-heavy, carb-free version sold in supplement aisles and diet books. Prehistoric humans were flexible, opportunistic eaters. Meat mattered, sometimes a lot, especially for cold climate groups like European Neanderthals. But so did tubers, seeds, wild grains, fruit, insects, and enormous amounts of honey, depending entirely on where and when you happened to be born. The biggest myth this data kills is the idea that our ancestors avoided carbohydrates. They didn't avoid them. They ground them, pounded them, roasted them, and in at least one case got cavities from them over 100,000 years before farming even existed. The second myth it kills is the idea of a single ancestral template you can copy today. There isn't one. There were as many prehistoric diets as there were prehistoric environments. There's also a quieter myth worth naming. The idea that the fossil record itself proves meat dominance. It doesn't. Not on its own. Butchered animal bones survive burial, fire, and tens of thousands of years remarkably well. Berries, tubers, and leafy greens mostly rot away within a season. So for decades, archaeologists were reading a menu with half the pages missing, and the half that survived happened to be the meat page. Once dental calculus and isotope chemistry gave researchers a way to read the missing pages, the picture didn't just add a few side dishes. In many populations, it flipped who was doing the heavy lifting, calorically speaking. What actually mattered across every single one of these diets wasn't the ratio of meat to plants. It was variety, whole foods, and a level of physical activity almost no modern lifestyle comes close to matching. So next time you see "eat like a caveman" slapped on a package, you can say, with real evidence behind you, which caveman? The one hunting mammoths in Ice Age Belgium, or the one grinding acorns in East Asia, or the one filling up on honey in a Tanzanian dry season? They all count. None of them looked like a steak-only diet plan. If you want more of these myth-busting deep dives into how we actually know what we know about prehistory, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel does every week. And tell me in the comments, would you actually survive a week eating like the Hadza seasonal honey binges and all? I'll be reading every answer.